Monique Dubois disappeared on a humid August night in Charlotte, North Carolina. The city, home to more than 500,000 people, had spent the day under a sweltering summer sun that left a sticky film on everything, and heat that continued to rise from the asphalt long after sunset. At 9:38 p.m., surveillance cameras at a Harris Teeter supermarket recorded the 29-year-old accountant as she walked through the automatic doors, a single grocery bag in one hand and her car keys in the other. Monique was dressed in a light denim jacket and white sneakers, her slender figure briefly illuminated by the intense orange-yellow glow of the parking lot lights. A security guard caught a fleeting glimpse of her moving across the expansive lot. Her form then vanished between a row of parked sedans and pickup trucks. The events that followed that moment would become a haunting mystery for North Carolina for the next 2 decades. On that oppressive late August evening in the year 2000, Charlotte was enveloped in the thick, moist air typical of a Carolina summer, as daytime temperatures that had soared past 95 degrees finally began to recede. The neon signs of fast food restaurants and gas stations lining Billy Graham Parkway cast shimmering reflections on the pavement, which was still warm enough to create distorted heat mirages. Monique Dubois, an accountant for a small local logistics firm, had just wrapped up a late day at the office. The young woman, who lived by herself in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, frequently made a quick stop at the nearby Harris Teeter to grab a few things for the next morning's breakfast. Her colleagues knew her as a dependable professional who was almost never late, while her neighbors spoke of a pleasant woman who tended to the flowers on her balcony every morning. Around 9:40 p.m., the store's security system captured Monique pushing her cart toward the checkout line. She appeared weary from a long workday, but was still impeccably dressed in a pale blue blouse. Moments later, she exited through the supermarket's sliding glass doors with a paper bag in her hand, moving briskly across the brightly lit parking area. This would be the last recorded image of her ever taken. From that point on, Monique Dubois seemed to have been erased from existence. That night, her mother in a quiet Raleigh suburb grew uneasy. On the passenger seat lay Monique's wallet and her older model cell phone, as if she had simply evaporated in an instant. The trucker promptly notified the highway patrol. The news traveled quickly to the Dubois family, throwing their household into a state of chaos and fear. Monique's mother began a frantic series of calls to relatives and friends, her voice cracking as she repeated the word, "missing." Her brother, Jamal, sped toward Charlotte, his heart racing with the dreadful possibilities. At the Dubois family home, coffee grew cold in mugs on the breakfast table as everyone sat frozen, staring at one another in a desperate search for answers. Overcome with helplessness, they took the only action they could think of. They contacted the police to report Monique as a missing person. When the distressed call came into the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's dispatch center, the operator carefully transcribed every word from Mrs. Dubois' trembling voice. Within an hour, a patrol unit was sent to the stretch of highway where the silver Corolla had been discovered. The area was quickly secured, with yellow tape stretched around the car, marking a somber new phase in the case. The Dubois family was requested to come to the station to give official statements, while investigators initiated a high-priority missing person file. Monique Dubois, female, 29, approximately 5 feet 5, with dark brown hair and brown eyes. Her occupation was listed as an accountant, with no history of criminal activity or mental health concerns. Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, a veteran detective with extensive experience in disappearances within the Charlotte area, was assigned to lead the investigation. He immediately directed his team to piece together the final 24 hours of Monique's life. She had departed from her office at 7:55 p.m., made a stop at the Harris Teeter at 9:38 p.m., and then vanished. The family provided small but potentially vital details. Monique called every single evening, a routine she seldom broke. Her mother stressed that Monique would never willingly leave her phone or wallet behind. Her brother added that she had no financial troubles, no involvement in dangerous relationships, and no significant romantic disputes. Officers inquired about her eating. No plans to travel far that evening. In an emergency meeting room at the police station, a large whiteboard was quickly filled with notes. 8 p.m., left office. 9:38 p.m., supermarket camera. After that, a significant gap in the timeline. Thorne underlined the word gap twice, knowing this void would define the entire investigation. An assistant investigator was assigned to contact Monique's closest friends to see if she had any other plans. One friend mentioned that Monique had talked about buying some new items for her apartment, but hadn't specified which stores she would visit. This detail prompted the police to broaden their search of surveillance footage. Meanwhile, the crime lab took possession of the Corolla. An initial inspection revealed no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact and the keys were accounted for. Inside, the wallet, phone, and grocery bag remained undisturbed. An investigator remarked that if this had been a robbery, the perpetrators would not have left everything behind. Unidentified fingerprints were lifted from the car, but they didn't match any records in the existing databases. The police also observed that the fuel tank was nearly full, which ruled out the possibility that she had run out of gas. The Dubois family, meanwhile, was caught in a torturous limbo between hope and terror. Her aging father wrote down every detail he could remember on a piece of paper, from Monique's height to a small scar on her wrist, and handed it to the police. Her mother repeated, "She would never leave without telling me. Never." Thorne understood the urgency. He requested an immediate alert be sent to all CMPD units and neighboring jurisdictions, and he coordinated with the FBI to prepare for the possibility that the case might extend across state lines. As the meeting concluded, he reviewed the timeline one last time. From 8 p.m. to 9:38 p.m., everything was accounted for. But from that point until her car was discovered, it was as if the humid Carolina night had swallowed all traces of her. Thorne gripped his pen tightly, fully aware that he was in a race against time, where every passing yellow tape and set up a command tent. Inside, satellite maps of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County were spread across a table, with red pins marking points of interest. As the sun climbed higher, search teams formed lines and began to move methodically through the brush and rocky terrain. K9 units worked the hard, dry ground, their noses to the earth in search of any human scent. Overhead, police helicopters circled, their infrared cameras scanning the landscape for any abnormal heat signatures. The entire operation had the precision of a military exercise. Thorne moved among the search parties, his voice firm. "We don't miss a single inch. She's out there, and we will find her." The Dubois family was present from the beginning, standing behind the police barriers, their eyes tracking every figure moving through the woods, every distant bark of a dog. Mrs. Dubois clutched a metal railing, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her husband stood beside her, wordless, gripping a college graduation photo of Monique, her bright smile a stark contrast to the grim reality of the day. Local news crews had gathered, their cameras sweeping across the search teams, the morning light glinting off the dark blue of the police uniforms. A reporter pushed forward, asking, "Do you have any leads, Lieutenant?" Thorne remained composed. "We are utilizing every resource at our disposal. Specific details will be shared when it is appropriate." By noon, with temperatures climbing into the high 90s, many of the volunteers were showing signs of exhaustion and were rotated out. The oppressive heat carried the smells of hot asphalt and damp earth, occasionally overpowered by the fumes from the helicopters. Piles of empty water bottles grew beside the command tent. Thorne sank into a folding chair inside the tent, his shirt soaked with sweat, his gaze fixed on the map. He knew that if the second day passed without a significant breakthrough, the case would enter a perilous gray area where disappearances without a trace parked close to the shoulder. Its headlights were on, and he could make out a figure standing nearby. In a hurry to make his delivery, he hadn't stopped, but the image had returned to him with stark clarity when he saw the news that morning. Thorne listened to the report, making a red notation on the map. He circled the area and wrote, "Ford F-150, green, 10 p.m., witness." The command tent grew quiet. A young investigator offered, "It could be a coincidence, but it might be the lead we need." Thorne nodded. "We can't afford to overlook anything." He immediately instructed the tech team to pull all available traffic camera footage from the highway between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. and contacted the DMV to run a check on registrations for green Ford F-150s in Mecklenburg County and the surrounding areas. Crimson. Outside, the search pressed on until dusk. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red, casting a dramatic glow over the landscape. The helicopters returned to their base, leaving behind only the sound of the wind and the tired barks of the canine units. Volunteers collapsed onto the ground, hands on their knees, their faces flushed from the heat. The Dubois family remained, clinging to the faint hope that any moment might bring news. As the last of the light faded, Thorne gathered his files, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The urgent search on the second day had ended in a stalemate. There was no sign of Monique and no direct evidence. Only the witness's account of the green F-150 remained, a phantom that had emerged from the night only to disappear again. But in Thorne's mind it was the first, however fragile, piece of a puzzle that could lead them into the dark mystery that had enveloped Monique Dubois. The image of the dark green Ford F-150 was still prominent in Lieutenant Thorne's thoughts as he began the third day of the investigation. However, he knew that focusing exclusively on the elusive truck from the witness's report would be a mistake. Years of experience had taught him, voice thick with emotion. "We didn't talk much anymore, but I swear I would never want anything bad to happen to her." Next, Monique's co-workers from the logistics firm were questioned individually. Most of them described her as a dedicated and kind person who avoided conflict. However, one co-worker, Brenda Jones, shared a piece of information that immediately caught Thorne's attention. "About 2 weeks before she went missing, Monique told me she felt like someone was watching her," Brenda said. "She wasn't sure who it was, but a few times after work she noticed a strange car parked near the employee lot. The headlights were aimed right at her usual parking spot. When she tried to get a better look, the car would drive away. Brenda added that Monique had been feeling anxious and had even considered changing her work schedule to avoid leaving the office so late. This detail was marked with a red flag in the case file, raising a critical question. Could the strange car Monique had mentioned be connected to the green F-150 seen near her Corolla? By the afternoon, the police were canvassing the area around Monique's apartment building. An elderly woman who lived down the hall remarked, "Monique was always so polite, often helping me with my groceries. But lately, I noticed she would look over her shoulder in the hallway, as if she were on alert." A younger neighbor recalled hearing footsteps in the corridor late at night around the time Monique usually returned, but when he opened his door to check, there was no one there. These fragmented accounts began to form a disturbing picture. Monique had been feeling uneasy in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, possibly because she was being stalked. Thorne and his team compiled a list of 5 persons of interest. It included Kevin Maxwell, 2 co-workers who shared late shifts with Monique, a young neighbor who was frequently in the parking lot late at night, and a building maintenance worker whose schedule sometimes coincided with Monique's late arrivals. None of them were arrested, but all were flagged for continued monitoring. Thorne warned his team, "Don't be too quick to rule anyone out. A solid statement today could fall apart tomorrow." The Dubois family visited the station, conducting interviews. They needed to delve deeper into the Corolla. It was the only piece of physical evidence directly tied to Monique, and their best hope for finding clues about who had led her into the darkness. On the morning of the 4th day, the car was transported to the CMPD's forensic garage and placed under the stark white lights of the examination bay. Technicians began to meticulously dismantle it, treating each part with extreme care, as if a single mistake could erase a hidden secret. The driver's seat was the first to be examined. A technician leaned in close, shining a bright light on the upholstery, and then called out softly, "There's a stain here." It was a faint, brownish mark, smaller than a dime, located on the edge of the seat near where the driver's left hip would be. A sample was carefully scraped into a sealed vial. It was impossible to immediately identify it as blood, coffee, or some other substance, but Thorne made a note. "Unusual stain. Requires biochemical analysis." On the driver's side seatbelt, under a powerful microscope, they discovered a single, long, dark brown hair. It was noticeably different in color and texture from Monique's hair. The hair was lifted with specialized tweezers and placed in an anti-static plastic bag. It had the potential to be a critical clue, but in the year 2000, DNA testing was not yet advanced enough to extract a full genetic profile from a single hair shaft without the root. Thorne asked the lead technician, "Can we get a profile from this now?" The technician shook his head. "We can only confirm basic characteristics, like whether it's human or animal. For a full DNA profile, we'd need the root. This is just a fragment." The response caused Thorne to frown, a stark reminder of how the technology of the era was limiting their investigation. Forensic experts continued to inspect the car's interior, including the floor, gearshift, steering wheel, and passenger seat. There were no signs that the car had been rummaged through. The wallet and phone remained untouched, reinforcing Ford F-150 had indeed been parked next to the Corolla on the night Monique vanished. But how many green Ford F-150s were there in Mecklenburg County? The number could be in the thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands. It was a valuable clue, but one that opened up a vast sea of information that would be nearly impossible to manage. Thorne noted in his report, unknown hair, driver's seat. Unidentified stain, driver's seat. Suspected F-150 tire mark, seen. These 3 points formed a diagram, but they all led to a technological dead end. He knew that in 2000 the FBI's CODIS system was still in its early stages, with limited DNA data available nationwide, making a match from a single hair fragment a near impossibility. The room was filled with the familiar sense of frustration that accompanied many investigations of that time. The evidence was there, but it wasn't strong enough to identify a suspect. Back in the white tent at the command post, Thorne spread a map out and marked it with red dots. He addressed his team. We have 3 clues. None of them are enough to charge anyone, but they all point to one possibility. Monique didn't just vanish on her own. Someone else drove this car here, sat in the driver's seat, buckled the seatbelt, and may have left in an F-150. All eyes were fixed on him, the mood tense but sparked with a renewed sense of determination. A young investigator asked, "What's our next move if the DNA doesn't produce any results?" Thorne replied firmly, "We keep going. Seal all the samples and send them to the state lab. Preserve the crime scene photos and reports. Time may be working against us, but science will continue to advance. One day, these hairs and stains will tell their story." Meanwhile, the press coverage was relentless. CMPD still without leads in Monique Dubois case, blared a bold headline in the Charlotte Observer. The Dubois family watched each news broadcast in agony, their hope slowly turning to despair. Monique's mother asked Thorne, "Have they found anything in her car yet?" He couldn't bring himself to share the inconclusive details, only saying, "We're still analyzing everything. Please trust that we are not giving up." That other nearby cities. The Charlotte Observer ran a bold headline. Charlotte woman vanishes mysteriously. Police suspect foul play. The only available image of her, taken by the Harris Teeter security camera as she clutched a grocery bag and walked through the sliding glass doors, was printed with stark clarity. Her tired but gentle face became a symbol of a disappearance that had deeply unsettled the community. Local television stations set up their equipment near the search area, with reporters broadcasting live updates every hour. Residents across the state followed the case on their screens, engaging in debates in coffee shops, supermarkets, and workplaces. Did she leave with someone she knew, or was she the victim of a random act of violence? Rumors spread more quickly than any official press release, making an already murky case even more difficult to navigate. The Dubois family, who were typically very private, found themselves thrust into the center of a media storm. Mrs. Dubois, Monique's mother, appeared on a Charlotte television channel for the first time, her face gaunt and her eyes red-rimmed under the harsh studio lights. "Please help us find our daughter," she pleaded to the camera. She would never leave without a reason. She would never abandon her family. Her trembling but resolute voice moved many viewers to tears. Her brother Jamal also made an appearance, issuing a call to action for the community. These images were broadcast repeatedly, transforming a local incident into a statewide news phenomenon. However, the media frenzy also had a dark side. Some tabloid papers ran sensational headlines like, "Monique ran off with a secret lover," or "Debt-ridden woman flees town." The family was deeply pained by these articles, knowing that Monique had no financial problems or complicated romantic entanglements. In a brief press conference, Thorne stood before a bank of cameras and stated with a firm voice, "We have reason to believe this was not a voluntary disappearance. The evidence at the scene suggests foul play. This is now being treated as a criminal investigation." His words were quoted verbatim in most major news outlets. A clear attempt by the police to assert their position amidst the swirling rumors. Neighbors watched their every move. Monique's father, a naturally reserved man, repeatedly declined interview requests. But he also understood that media attention was the only thing keeping the case from fading away. He quietly told Thorne, "We don't like all this noise, but if it helps find her, we'll endure it." As the days turned into a week, Monique Dubois' name was everywhere, on the radio, in print, and on television. The image of the 29-year-old woman with kind brown eyes became a topic of discussion on late-night talk shows, where self-proclaimed experts debated whether it was a voluntary disappearance or a criminal abduction. The polarized public opinion only deepened the family's pain. To them, there was no debate. Monique would never have vanished on her own. Amidst this chaotic environment, Thorne had to maintain a delicate balance, sharing enough information to reassure the public while withholding key details to protect the integrity of the investigation. He knew that any careless word spoken on camera could be seen by a potential suspect. Each night, when he returned to his office, he would see Monique's face on the television screen, her eyes seeming to plead to be found. That immense weight transformed the case from a professional duty into a personal responsibility that he could not let go of. By the end of the first week, the atmosphere in Charlotte was heavier than ever, burdened by the relentless media coverage, a community divided between hope and suspicion, and a family exhausted by worry and public scrutiny. In his mind, Thorne knew that without a breakthrough soon, the Monique Dubois case was at risk of falling into a dangerous silence, where only rumors and headlines would remain, and the truth would slip further and further away. The first week passed in a whirlwind of media attention. Then came the second and the third, and as public interest began to wane, new headlines in North Carolina pushed Monique's story to the background. But inside the investigation room at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, Lieutenant Thorne and his team continued to doggedly review every piece of evidence and every statement. They revisited parking lots and gas stations along the highway, with a chilling finality: possible abduction, no body. Those stark words became Monique's new legal status. Thorne knew this meant a significant reduction in manpower and resources. The case would no longer be a priority and would only be revisited if new leads emerged. He closed the thick file with a heavy sigh, feeling as if he had just abandoned a life in the dense Carolina woods. The Dubois family received this news with a sense of utter despair. They had been hoping for a clear path forward in the investigation, but now all they had were promises. "We will reopen the case as soon as we have new information," they were told. Mrs. Dubois wept at a press conference, clutching a photo of her daughter. Mr. Dubois stared blankly ahead, his eyes hollow. To them, Monique was not a case number or a possible abduction. She was their daughter, their flesh and blood, their reason for waking up each morning. But they refused to let her case fade into obscurity. That summer, the Dubois family and Monique's friends organized a candlelight vigil in a downtown Charlotte park. Dozens of people attended, holding white candles and singing prayers. The flickering lights reflected on the anxious faces of her parents, a fragile symbol of their hope that the truth would one day emerge. The press covered the event, but it was relegated to small corners of the newspapers, like a footnote to a story that had already concluded. Year after year, the family continued to hold these vigils. They printed posters with Monique's image and hung them at bus stops and on utility poles throughout Charlotte and Raleigh. Each poster read, "Missing since August 12, 2000. If you have any information, please call the CMPD hotline." The phone number was printed in bold letters below, but it rarely rang. Occasionally, the family would receive anonymous calls, which were often cruel hoaxes or taunts. Each time, their sense of isolation in their fight against oblivion deepened. Lieutenant Thorne, though assigned to other cases, would periodically pull Monique's file from the cold case archives. He would stare at the sealed evidence bag containing the unknown hair and the photo of the tire mark, wondering if in 10 or 20 years, gently. In their eyes, time had frozen in the year 2000, and the memory of the young woman who had vanished that night remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. For Lieutenant Thorne, the possible abduction, no body, file sat on a shelf alongside hundreds of other North Carolina cold cases. But he knew that behind each of those files was a family waiting, living in a state of perpetual pain. And for Monique Dubois' case, he felt something different. A persistent sense that the silver Corolla, the unknown hair, and the green F-150 from the witness's account were real pieces of a puzzle, just waiting for the right moment to come together and reveal the truth. When Monique Dubois' file was officially designated as a cold case with the label, "Possible Abduction, No Body," the months that followed turned into a grueling and seemingly endless wait. The Dubois family held vigils, distributed flyers, and petitioned the police department. But the investigation had little new information to report. Throughout the early 2000s, the file was periodically opened and closed, like a door being stirred by a faint breeze but never fully pushed open. Each new major case in North Carolina diverted manpower and funding, leaving Monique's case shrouded in darkness. In early 2002, Thorne made an attempt to resubmit the hair and the stain from the Corolla's seat to the state lab for a CODIS comparison. The result was the same. No match. There was no record in the federal criminal DNA database that matched the sample. This meant that the perpetrator, if there was one, had either never been arrested or had never been profiled. A brief flicker of hope was quickly extinguished. In 2004, another review focused on the tire mark impression. A forensic expert in mechanics compared the tread pattern to dozens of different tire types, but could only conclude that it was likely from a Ford F-150, which was insufficient evidence for a unique identification. As time passed, many of the veteran investigators who had worked on the case began to leave the force. Thorne, who still held on to the case, watched as his colleagues retired or transferred to other departments. A new generation in the mid-2000s, as online forums dedicated to true crime and unsolved disappearances began to flourish, Monique Dubois' name resurfaced on sites like Web Sleuths. Curious members of these online communities dug up old news articles and reshared the grainy image from the supermarket security camera. Someone claiming to be a former college classmate of Monique's posted that she had been introverted and had few close friends, which made her disappearance seem even more strange. These online discussions never yielded any solid evidence, but they did help to keep her story from being completely buried. The Dubois family would occasionally read these posts, finding some small comfort in the knowledge that some people still remembered, yet also feeling a sense of pain, knowing that the internet's fleeting interest could not bring Monique back. Meanwhile, Thorne carried a lingering sense of guilt. He would sometimes visit the evidence locker, reopen Monique's file, and stare at the sealed bag containing the unknown hair. He held on to the belief that one day, technology would advance enough to unlock the DNA hidden within it. But for the time being, it was just a wish. Each time he closed the file, it felt like a heavy iron door shutting, locking the truth away once more. By the late 2000s, Monique Dubois' case was just one of hundreds of cold cases in the CMPD's archives. New residents of Charlotte were unaware that a young woman had vanished from the very roads they traveled every day. Only the Dubois family and a few aging investigators remembered. For a full decade, from 2000 to 2010, the truth seemed to have been completely swallowed by the dense Carolina landscape, leaving behind an unfillable void. As the new decade began, Monique Dubois' file had faded into the dust of time. But fate often has a strange way of bringing the past back to the surface. 16 years after her disappearance, on a scorching June morning in 2016, a crew of construction workers on an expansion project for NC Highway 160, near the Steel Creek area of Charlotte, started their shift as usual. Bulldozers roared to life, and shovels pierced the hard, cracked earth. A worker named Leon brushed away the dust and dirt. They recovered 3 distinct items: a frayed denim jacket, a silver heart-shaped necklace that had turned a rusty green color, and a pair of white sneakers with a faded logo. Despite the erosion caused by time, these items were a match for the description the Dubois family had provided in 2000. Monique had been wearing a denim jacket, a cherished silver necklace, and her favorite pair of sneakers on the night she vanished. Notably, the discovery site was just 5 miles from where her Corolla had been found abandoned. Misinformation. Lieutenant Thorne, now in his 60s and serving as a consultant for the Cold Case Unit, received a call that night. As he drove to the scene, his headlights illuminated the fluttering police tape in the darkness of the woods, and memories from 16 years ago came flooding back. He stood silently by the shallow pit, watching as the experts collected each bone and scrap of fabric. The guilt that he had carried for over a decade welled up inside him. "We finally brought her home," he whispered to himself. The excavation process took 2 full days. The experts used soft brushes to clear away the sand and clay, carefully numbering each bone, photographing it, and placing it in an evidence bag. The skeleton was largely intact, which suggested that the body had been buried soon after death and had not been disturbed by animals. There were marks on the ribs that suggested a powerful blow to the chest. But determining the exact cause of death would require a more detailed analysis. The items found with the remains were urgently sealed and sent for examination. The silver necklace was particularly poignant. On the inner side of the heart, there was a faint, handwritten engraving. M.D. Monique Dubois's initials. When the family was informed, they broke down. Her mother collapsed at her kitchen table, clutching a photograph of Monique wearing that very necklace on her. Found a perfect fit. "We have a positive indication," Dr. Reed noted in her report. "But, for absolute certainty, DNA testing was required." A sample was drilled from a femur bone, and mitochondrial DNA was extracted. This was then compared to a sample that had been taken from Monique's mother and stored in the case file for 16 years. When the results came back, Lieutenant Thorne was at the lab. He stood beside Dr. Reed as she placed the printed report on the table. He saw the conclusion. Match, 99.9%. There was no longer any doubt. The remains belonged to Monique Dubois. Thorne closed his eyes and took a deep breath. After 16 years of waiting, they finally had an answer, though it was the one that no one had wanted. The Dubois family was called to the station to hear the official news. When an officer read the words, "The DNA is a match for Monique Dubois," the room fell silent. Her mother collapsed, her hands covering her face, her choked sobs echoing in the quiet room. Her father, his eyes red with unshed tears, remained rigid, as if trying to bear the weight of the family's pain. Her brother Jamal slammed his hand on the table and whispered, At least we found her." The air in the room was heavy with a mixture of unbearable grief and a strange sense of closure after so many years of living in limbo. A week later, a second funeral was held for Monique at a cemetery in a Raleigh suburb. This time, it wasn't a prayer service for a missing person, but a final farewell for someone who was truly gone. The coffin was adorned with white flowers, and the rusted silver necklace and tattered denim jacket were placed beside it, like silent witnesses to her final journey. Hundreds of people attended the service, including old friends, former co-workers, neighbors, and some of the volunteers from the original 2000 search. They stood in long rows holding candles. Their flickering light meant to guide Monique to peace. Her mother spoke cause of death. The evidence confirmed that Monique's death was not natural. The final report stated, homicide, evidence of blunt force trauma. The 2000 disappearance was now officially a murder case. Thorne held the report in his hands, feeling a strange combination of relief and burden. He was relieved that they now had grounds to pursue a criminal investigation. But the burden felt heavier than ever, knowing that Monique had been brutally killed. He knew the file would not be returning to the shelf. It was now back at the center of the investigation, and their new mission was to find the perpetrator. The Dubois family, amidst their grief, held on to their faith in justice. Monique's brother told the press, "We waited 16 years to find her. We're ready to wait longer, as long as the person who did this faces a trial." His words were widely quoted, a vow of resilience in the face of unimaginable loss. As night fell after the funeral, Thorne stood silently by Monique's new gravestone, a single flickering candle in his hand. He knew that everything had changed. The Monique Dubois case was no longer one of hundreds of dust-covered cold cases. It was active again, with solid evidence and a death certificate that was officially marked as murder. He vowed that no matter how many more years it took, he would not let the killer escape justice. The forensic report that concluded Monique's death was a homicide immediately brought the case back to the core of the investigation. Days after the funeral, Lieutenant Thorne and the Cold Case Task Force returned to the construction site in Steel Creek where the remains had been discovered. The summer desert had been replaced by the scorching Carolina heat, and the red clay soil was splotched with patches of dry grass under the relentless sun. The police re-established the excavation area, setting up a white tent and using yellow tape to mark out a grid, meter by meter. They knew that to track down the killer after 16 years, they had to return to the place where Monique had been left. Technicians used metal detectors to scan the area around the burial pit. It wasn't long before they found small, rusted pieces of measurements and compared them to the data from the 2000 crime scene, finding patterns that were consistent with the tires used on late 1990s Ford F-150s. Although the impression was faint, it provided further evidence that a truck had been at that location, supporting the scenario of a killer using a vehicle to dispose of the body. Thorne gathered the team in the command tent and began to write a clear timeline on the whiteboard. 9:38 p.m., Monique leaves Harris Teeter, captured on camera. Approximately 10 p.m., witness sees a green Ford F-150 parked near the location of the Corolla. After 10 p.m., Corolla is abandoned, wallet and phone intact, no signs of robbery. Night of August 12, 2000. Monique is subdued, killed, and transported by truck. Approximately 5 miles from the Corolla site, her body is shallowly buried in the Steel Creek area. The details now formed a coherent timeline. From the moment she left the supermarket to the time she was buried, all likely occurring within the span of about an hour. This suggested that the killer had not acted impulsively but had planned the crime, choosing a remote spot, having a vehicle ready, and striking at the moment Monique was most vulnerable. In an internal report, Thorne wrote, "The killer knew this terrain. The distance from the supermarket to the burial site is short, and the route is easily accessible. It is likely that the killer lived or worked in the vicinity of Charlotte or the Steel Creek area." He also noted Monique's prior mention to a coworker about feeling like she was being watched, which reinforced the theory that the perpetrator had been stalking her, waiting for the right opportunity to act. As the soil samples, metal fragments, and tire mark impressions were sealed for lab analysis, Thorne stood by the now empty pit. The dark stains on the earth marked the spot where the excavation had taken place days earlier. He recalled seeing the abandoned Corolla back in 2000. The strange hair, the faint stain on the seat. What had been inconclusive evidence then was now being revived in a new investigation. Technology had advanced significantly. DNA could now be extracted from minuscule samples, and the CODIS database had grown exponentially. Unearthed with the remains became the central focus of a new investigative plan. Lieutenant Thorne, now a consultant for the Cold Case Unit, but deeply bound to this case, urged the younger team to utilize the modern DNA technology that had been unavailable in 2000. "We are holding evidence that the past has left for us. It's time for the present to unlock it," he said during a closed-door meeting. In 2019, fabric samples from the denim jacket were sent to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a firm renowned for its work in forensic genealogy, which combines DNA analysis with family tree research to identify potential suspects. Previously, the strange hair and the incomplete DNA profile had hit dead ends with CODIS. But now, new microanalysis techniques could build a detailed genetic profile from even the tiniest samples, and cross-reference them with millions of records in public genealogy databases. When the results came back, a complex family tree appeared on the screen, tracing relationships from distant relatives to closer ones. The experts at Parabon highlighted a recurring name: the Bishop family, with roots in Greensboro, North Carolina. The genetic map showed that the DNA samples from the jacket matched a multi-generational branch of this family, meaning that the killer, or at least the person who had left their DNA on Monique's jacket, was a bishop. The CMPD coordinated with the police departments in Greensboro and the surrounding counties. They began to review all men with the surname Bishop who had been living in the Greensboro area around the year 2000. The list was long, including mechanics, maintenance workers, and engineers. But when they combined this information with the old case data, the witness report of a green F-150, Monique's known routes, and records of Charlotte residents, one name stood out: Nathaniel Bishop. When Nathaniel Bishop's name was written on the whiteboard in the meeting room, the team fell silent. Not everyone was familiar with him, but the DNA and genealogy data were undeniable. Thorne, his voice calm but firm, said, "All the clues are pointing to Bishop." From that moment on, the process of narrowing down his ownership of the truck from 1996 to 2001. It had later been sold to a scrapyard in Greensboro and was now untraceable. Thorne stared at a blurry photo of the F-150 from the archives, a frown on his face. "This is the phantom we've been chasing from day one," he said. Delving deeper, investigators uncovered an overlooked event from Bishop's past. In 1999, while he was working as a maintenance man for a Charlotte construction firm, a female coworker had filed a harassment complaint against him. She alleged that he would stand too close to her, touch her shoulder, and make uncomfortable comments. The company had noted the complaint, but had not escalated it to the police. Bishop received an internal warning and was transferred to a different department. There were no charges filed and no criminal record created, which is why he had not been in the CODIS database in 2000. Thorne lightly pounded the table when he heard this. If someone had taken that complaint more seriously back then, he said, Monique might not have died. Younger detectives began to track down old neighbors, former co-workers, and even some of Bishop's high school friends. A complex picture of the man began to emerge. Bishop was not overtly conspicuous, but many people recalled that he had a tendency to stare at women for longer than was comfortable, or would appear in places where he wasn't expected. A former construction coworker said, "He had a look about him that was unsettling, like he was calculating something. But he never caused any real trouble openly, so no one ever did anything about it." To bolster their suspicions, the team reviewed Bishop's movements around August of 2000. They discovered that he had taken 2 days off from work immediately after Monique's disappearance, citing illness, but had never provided a doctor's note. Those 2 days aligned perfectly with the time frame in which the police believed Monique had been killed and buried. Thorne circled this information in red, his voice low. That's not a coincidence. Once Nathaniel Bishop was identified as the prime suspect, the team knew that their next step required the utmost caution. They needed to obtain a direct, indisputable sample of his DNA to prove that this 52-year-old man was the one. At noon, he would smoke a cigarette outside the company's parking lot, flicking the butt onto the sidewalk and crushing it with his boot. In the evenings, he would eat dinner with his wife and children and sometimes take the dog for a walk. To his neighbors, Bishop was a normal, friendly man. To the police, every move he made was a potential opportunity. For the first week, they simply observed, recording his every move on video. Thorne wanted to ensure that Bishop's routine was stable enough for them to intervene without arousing suspicion. In the second week, as Bishop left the coffee shop and tossed his used cup, with his lip marks on the lid, into a public trash can, a disguised detective swiftly retrieved it and sealed it in an evidence bag. A few days later, they collected 2 Marlboro cigarette butts that Bishop had discarded in the company parking lot. All of these items were rushed to the state crime lab. The wait for the results was one of the most tense periods of Thorne's career. He sat in his office, staring at the old photo of Monique on the board, recalling the promise he had made to her family. "We won't let the killer escape." Finally, on a sweltering June afternoon, the phone rang. The forensic expert on the other end of the line said firmly, "It's a perfect match. The DNA from the coffee cup and the cigarette butts matches the sample found on Monique Dubois' jacket." The room fell into a heavy silence. Thorne exhaled deeply, then stood up, his eyes blazing with a mixture of relief and anger. "No more denials," he said. The young detectives patted each other on the back, but no one smiled. They knew this wasn't a victory, but rather the final step in a 2-decade-long journey. They had found the man whose DNA had marked the darkness of that night in 2000. The man who had buried Monique in the red Carolina earth. The report was printed and stamped in red. Full DNA match, Nathaniel Bishop. Thorne held it in his hands, his fingers tight. He knew all the pieces now fit together. The witness's F-150, the truck tire marks, the burial site miles from the Corolla, the 1999 harassment complaint. Morning. But, for the team from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, it was a day of reckoning. After receiving the undeniable DNA results, Lieutenant Thorne and his team had finalized the paperwork for Nathaniel Bishop's arrest warrant. A Mecklenburg County judge signed it at 5 a.m., and immediately, a SWAT team, in coordination with the Greensboro Police, began the operation. They acted with swiftness and precision, determined to prevent Bishop from destroying any evidence or attempting to flee. Bishop's one-story house was situated in a quiet Greensboro suburb, with small, manicured lawns and white fences separating the homes. For years, his neighbors had seen him as an ordinary man who walked his dog, made small talk about the weather, and helped clear leaves from the sidewalks. No one suspected that the man they greeted daily was connected to a horrific 20-year-old murder case. At 5:30 a.m., the SWAT team's armored vehicles quietly rolled into the street. Officers in bulletproof vests, with their rifles at the ready, moved to surround the house. The command came over the radio. "Execute," a loudspeaker blared. "Nathaniel Bishop, this is the police. You are under arrest. Come out with your hands raised." Dogs began to bark, and lights flicked on in the neighboring houses. Bishop, still in his pajamas, stepped onto his porch, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Before he could react, he was subdued, forced to kneel on the concrete, and his hands were cuffed behind his back. Dozens of his neighbors watched in shock. Mrs. Marjorie, who lived next door, later told the press, "I was frozen. He greeted me every morning, and sometimes he would help me carry things in from my car. I never thought he could be tied to a murder." The entire neighborhood was in a state of shock. The police swiftly moved Bishop to an unmarked van, while investigators began to search his home, seizing computers, phones, documents, and old boxes stored in the garage. That afternoon, the news exploded across North Carolina television channels. A bold ticker ran across the bottom of the screen on a local Charlotte news station. "Cold case breakthrough. Arrest shocks North." Confessed. Is his DNA the only evidence? Thorne replied, "The investigation is ongoing, but we are confident in the evidence we have." The Dubois family learned of Bishop's arrest at their home in Mesa. Mrs. Dubois, Monique's mother, sobbed when she received the call from the police. "I have waited 20 years for this day," she said. "I can't believe it's real. My daughter can finally be vindicated." Monique's brother, Jamal, now a grown man, said simply, "He thought he could escape forever, but the truth always finds a way." In the North Carolina community, the arrest became a burning topic of conversation. Newspapers detailed the investigative journey, explaining the use of DNA and forensic genealogy, and emphasizing it as a prime example of how science could deliver justice after decades of waiting. The evening news broadcasts aired footage of the SWAT team storming Bishop's home, turning the event into an unforgettable moment for the residents of Greensboro. Bishop was taken to the Mecklenburg County Jail. As he was led past the cameras, he only shook his head and said nothing. His public defender issued an initial statement. "My client denies all charges. We will prove his innocence in court." But to the public, Bishop's silence only cemented his image as someone who had been hiding a dark secret for 20 years. In the following days, the press dug into Bishop's personal life. They revisited the 1999 harassment complaint, interviewed former co-workers, and delved into the history of the green Ford F-150 that had been seen near the 2000 crime scene. Each new piece of information only darkened the picture. A neighbor said, "Now that I think about it, there were times when he would disappear for a few days, and no one knew where he went. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it's chilling." Bishop's arrest not only brought an end to 2 decades of waiting, but also opened a new phase, preparing for the trial. With the matching DNA, the reinvestigated crime scene evidence, and a community demanding justice, Bishop now faced the very thing he thought he had escaped forever: the truth, exposed to the public.